Welcome to episode 4 of Testing Peers. This week we're going to talk about cognitive bias. Joining me, we've got Chris, and we've got David, and we've got Simon. So, hello guys, how's it going?
Do you like that? I've actually, it's light enough outside that you can actually see my trampoline out the back today.
I have to see a kind of white light.
It's a trampoline.
Oh, yes.
Is that a trampoline?
Very good.
It's a trampoline.
There you go.
Notice I called it my trampoline, not the children's.
Yeah, the children allowed on it, or
Yeah, when I'm working.
it's where you practice your acrobatics, where you still keep your game.
I did walk on my hands though. I did.
You
On
have
a
done.
trampoline.
No. Right, I did a kip up. That was exciting.
What's a kipper?
Kip up. So that's when you lie on your back and you flip onto your feet.
From a bit of acrobatics on a trampoline, how about acrobatics in your mind? What kind of leads you somewhere? What about a cognitive bias?
Lisa
Yeah.
Crispin did talk about it recently, didn't she?
Well, what has Mary Poppins taught us about cognitive biases?
Well, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Well, actually, she really goes against cognitive bias, doesn't she? Because she expects the unexpected with Mary Poppins.
Mm.
Yeah, but I think she tries to get people to challenge their preconceptions, to look at things in a different perspective. So she's trying to be quite open-minded and encourage
Yes.
people to go beyond their biases. The bank manager, Mr. Banks, who is kind of views of the world, people that think that the house can get repossessed, the financial worries, that sort of thing. She tries to put more of an open spin on things. And we have somehow gone on to Mary Poppins' cognitive bias, which is quite weird in itself. What was your first experience of cognitive bias? Because my first kind of hearing about cognitive bias was about estimation and sort of confirmation bias and things within estimations. So I originally, I think, did a training course where I worked where they talked about different estimation techniques, 3-point estimates and other things. And the one that obviously came up was kind of story points as a way to kind of use those to get around bias. That was probably the first time I'd heard in a work setting or anywhere else the sort of acknowledgement of the sort of the mental filters and the mental biases that we put in within life. And it was interesting to kind of be told something that became almost obvious and common sense straight after you heard it. So if someone told you that if I told you it would take you 5 minutes to walk up the stairs, you would base your estimate on my estimate. You kind of naturally go, oh, yeah, I used the data points I've got. Your information, you said 5 minutes, didn't seem crazy, therefore my estimate would be around yours. And people actually anchored other people to those things. A lot of biases that underlie only a little way beneath the surface, if that makes sense. But once you highlight them or talk about them, actually come to make a lot of sense. And there's a lot of biases in what we do and how we do things. Estimation is the kind of the obvious one to me, but decision making, sexism, things like that. There's lots of bias that creeps into every process we've got. Interviews. I think Simon talked about it in one of our earlier chats around looking at people that are the same as you. That's your bias to kind of your self-reflection. Beneath the surface, there's a lot of bias, and it's really good advice, I guess, to kind of always think about, is there something biasing what you do? Because even if you don't know the fancy name for it, it's probably there somewhere.
I think that's true. I think that especially the timings of things and tests, that often as people become more experienced on a project, if for whatever reason that person has to move on or there's a new phase and we have to get a new test onto that particular project, people involved in the project expect the test to be done in the same time because it's an experienced test and they forget that someone new has to be brought in. And I think that's a key thing, not just testing, but any new person on project, they expect them to be up and running as soon as possible and don't allow them time to get up to speed. And there can be a bit of friction between the group because of that, because they're not seen as being as valuable as quickly as possible.
It feels like you're talking into my life, David.
I think something that I've always found quite common as well, and I don't know what the real term for it is. Let's go with the term hierarchical bias. But it's kind of that scenario where if someone senior gives an estimate, just let's take estimates as an example. Someone senior gives an estimate, because they're senior, they almost kind of get the rub of the green and say, actually, yeah, the estimate we're going to go with. It ends up leading the conversation towards their estimate. And I've seen that quite a lot of times where it's been consciously put in place that the team lead or the senior people have gone, well, I think it's this. And then they've just let the rest of the team discuss it and they've come back to the same estimate that the leads come. And of course, that then almost puts a false confirmation bias for the lead that they were right. When actually, if they hadn't planted that seed at the start of the conversation, the estimate may have been very different. But there's also that sometimes plays in with the culture of the team as well, because there are some cultures which will look for that seniority person to lead them rather than challenge it, rather than question it. And it does depend sometimes on the makeup of the team on how that bias is impacted.
I think also it's the loudness of the people as well. Sometimes the people that
right.
are just loud and showy, people will automatically get behind them. And so it might not necessarily just be hierarchical. It might also be just the louder ones.
Yeah, there's sort of group thought and group thinking. People go along with the masses and that sort of stuff as well, which is always interesting. I have to say that I always find biases are very tightrope, because the examples we're just giving, for example, there's times where actually giving someone an indication of how long you think it'll take gives them an idea of what you're expecting, the scale, the scope, that sort of thing. If I tell you to build me a website, you've got a week. You'll probably have a different thing in your mind. Then, so you've got a website and you've got a year. You'll expect me to want more complicated things and so on. And it's trying to make sure you make the right choices to give the right outcomes. And that if you want a completely empowered team to make a choice, give them the data points to make that. Don't just go to someone, I've got this project, how long do you think it'll take? Because, yeah, they've got no chance. You've got to give them some data points or something. Order of magnitude type estimates and things become quite useful. Is it bigger than this?
There's a lot of interesting points, aren't there? Because you're saying that it's not only about your own personal cognitive bias, but it's also about biases that you have that you kind of want to subtly influence people or not. And sometimes you're aware of doing that, and sometimes you're not. You're sort of playing the system sometimes if you want to get your own way. Or I certainly, you can see that in certain discussions about delivery sometimes, where you can feel like someone's dropping in times or dates or headcount or something, and you can feel like they're doing that because they want you to sort of trickle along on their thought path. And sometimes the little petulant child within me makes a conscious effort to be like, in the same way when we talk about people, if someone's coaching you and you know that they're coaching you and you don't want to be coached, it's the same sort of thing where you automatically think you're manipulating me and I'm not having any of it. So it can be a dangerous game to play depending on who you're playing it with and how ballsy you're feeling or how annoyed you are generally in life. It's a really interesting point because it's different, because also if you've got quite a junior person, they need your guidance.
Yeah.
And we talk about with coaching that, or with one-to-ones and mentoring and stuff, it's sometimes you can't expect them to ask for your help, and you do have to put your experience and your biases on to them. You have to project them with the hope that they understand how you got to that decision as well. So sometimes it's explaining that as well that's actually important.
Yeah, it comes down to, I think, though, that fundamentally that biases exist. We all have them. They're part of how our brains work and how we filter information and so on. It's being conscious of them. Our input of our biases on others, the effect of our biases on us. How I interact with you guys is based upon my biases and my other things and so on. And I can challenge myself. And it's being conscious enough to be able to challenge yourself appropriately to make sure you're doing the thing for the right reason. You're not, we'll go back to the estimate analogy, but you're not saying 5 days because your boss says so. It's because you believe that, and you've got to make sure you ignore that data that was given and see, well, actually, does the other data match up to it? And if not, question it. As testers, we are very good at questioning things usually. It's one of our normally core skills that we develop. Generally, we're good at asking the right question in a way that doesn't alienate everyone. Obviously, we don't get it right 100%, and I guess when it comes to biases, the first thing is recognizing all the variety that exists. We've talked about a few here. I just Googled biases just to roughly see how many there might be. I think the list 150 came up. They're everywhere. But it is interesting because obviously the more we're aware of them, the more we do brief awareness sessions on them. We talk about the different ones we've got. I think, we talked about anchoring. It's kind of one of the key ones. But there's all sorts of things, group thought, group processes and stuff like that. The more that we can challenge them and make sure we're doing the thing for as good a reason as possible. We can't get rid of it. Who we are is who we are, but we need to be aware of it, reflect and grow. I
think it's also something that's not called out enough. This is a scenario that really blew my mind in my last place of work, where they'd get one person to write the test scripts and then 4 or 5 people will execute them. So you're constantly living on the bias of that one person that's written the scripts for everybody else, rather than giving everybody the freedom to go and write their own tests with their own biases. And the beauty of testing is you get more than one person involved in testing it. You're going to get a different picture of what's been put together than if you have one person leading it and their bias leading everybody else. So it's almost like you need to almost call out there is going to be bias in our testing here. We're not going to be able to test everything from every perspective, because I'm thinking about this from this angle. I've got this experience on this scenario, therefore that's the way I'm going to focus. Whereas somebody else is coming in, and it would always be my argument where I'd never want to put only one person on a testing project, because the bias means we will miss stuff naturally.
Yeah.
Obviously, you never always have that luxury. You might only have one person available to do the testing. But in an ideal world, I would always want to put multiple people on something, just to give us that coverage of biases.
It allows people to challenge, doesn't it? I think ultimately,
Yeah,
and challenging makes you think a lot more. You don't just get two opinions; you get the challenge, which gives you multiple perspectives. So yeah, I'm kind of with you on that one. I must prefer multiple people on a project versus one. It's very easy to get confirmation bias on your own opinions if you're the only one.
Yeah.
But your devs praising you or something like that, you just keep going.
And it's also that scenario where if you've got somebody testing a project and you want someone else to review your work, unless you're embedded in that project as well, that person that's coming from the outside will never look in enough detail to go, oh, actually, I think you can miss this and miss. They'll just go, yeah, your testing's fine, carry on. It really needs 2 or 3 people to be down in the weeds with you to be able to give you an accurate review of what you're doing and to give you the feedback that you need. But it's one of my frustrations about reviews. You can do reviews for the sake of reviews. I think peer reviews, test reviews, code reviews are important, but it needs to be with someone that's actually living it as well, rather than someone from the outside that's got absolutely no context of what you're doing.
Yeah. You just made me Google on that gap there, 2 of the most common ones, I guess, in software, which is the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. Which one do you think the testers may default to?
It's surprising though, because people always say testers are negative, but I actually think most testers that I know are incredibly positive people. They're just very sort of pragmatic.
And I think pragmatism sometimes gets misinterpreted as negativity, especially when there's projects like steamrolling everything and need to get out quickly. It's always the tester that's being pragmatic and saying, this is not feasible. We need to look at this from a more accurate perspective. And, you're just getting in our way. Let us out of the way. Let us release it.
Yeah, they try and give balance, I guess, is often the case. If someone wants to release it in a hurry, they want to go, well, what have we missed? If someone wants to kind of be deep and thoughtful, then they kind of want to go faster. They do the reflection, I guess, in many ways in the project.
But also the testers, having done their testing and been squeezed possibly by the time, they, like you say, give an accurate reflection of what has been covered and what hasn't been covered. And I think that can also give a negative view as to, well, why haven't you had a chance to do this? Well, it's because we didn't have time or we didn't have enough money or whatever. So therefore, because naturally as humans, again, the bias is we always concentrate on the negative and not what has been achieved.
Yeah, that's true. And again, as you said, in general project terms, end of a project, end of a sprint or anything else, the thing that's done last is the thing that's often left. And as much as we get testing further down the pipe, we do it as we go. There's still some things that require it to be almost done in order to actually check the full picture.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're always going to be that last cog to a degree.
And actually, we will always be seen as the problem, because if we don't find a problem, then it can go out and it'll be fine. But if we do find a problem, then it's test's fault.
Yeah.
And again, that's another bias.
Well, yeah, we break software. It's one that we often put out there as well as testers. Do we break software or find things that are broken within software?
I thought people always talk about the test failed, but generally the test hasn't failed. The code's failed. It's just the testers found it.
Yeah. The test didn't execute successfully.
The test has either found a failure in the code or it's found a failure in the system that or if it's automated, it found a failure in the automation.
There's a bias in the name of that because you think the test failed. Oh, well, the test failed.
Yeah, it's the tester's fault if the test fails.
Well, is it though? Could we have helped prevent the failure? Was that a whole different conversation?
That's a whole different conversation.
Root cause analysis.
That's the conversation I'm looking forward to getting into.
Yeah.
Preventing failure rather than detecting failure, right?
Exactly, yeah. The more you can prevent it, everyone's happier. Happier testers, happier developers.
I disagree that everyone's not happy with that. There is usually a big push to not have testers involved as early, especially in a non-agile enviement. Maybe in an agile world it's different, but
I'll phrase, everyone should be happier.
Should be,
in my opinion.
Yes.
He's pushing his cognitive bias.
Yeah.
No,
but in that scenario, it is about pushing bias to get them over that, them over that their own bias, that it's negative that tests are involved earlier on.
Yeah, but ultimately, whatever our job is, testers, software engineers, whatever we happen to have the job titles, etc., our role is generally to try and improve the quality of software or influence the quality of software. And that could be finding defects and getting them fixed. It could be other things.
Actually, what we've discussed just recently is that I think that the way and the language that people use is key to the biases that we have. Because like you said, if you have test failure, rather than if you said if it's it's a programmatic failure, then you look at it automatically as a different issue than if it's a test failure. So the language that we use and the way that we say things can enhance or diminish biases.
Definitely.
That's why semantics is so interesting, though, because half the time it genuinely doesn't matter, and then the other half of the time it's the most critical thing.
It's the patterns it generates. It's not the individual word said once. It means very little, but it's the pattern it generates, or the fact that someone may copy. If you're a leader in particular, if you use certain language, then your team will pick up on it subconsciously, try and mirror you, reflect you, etc. So if you use the test fail, then your team probably will. Now, if you try and change the language, you can try and change it by changing the words you use. But people are stuck in the habits. So don't get me wrong, Chris. Test failures are probably not going to be changed just because you decide you want to call them code failures or software not met expectations or something. Because it may not be code that failed.
It's just called it no worky.
Yeah. No worky, no likey.
But also the other thing is that if we change our language, so we change it from test failures to programmatic failures, we have to say it so many times in order for it to filter down to the people that have that bias, that have been bred to them for such a long time.
And it makes you realise your own biases as well, because
Yeah.
you might have been saying things for years before you actually understood that actually that thing is not appropriate, or it doesn't actually hit the mark.
You actually get to the point where you realise how ingrained things are in you.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, though. So we just put our own biases in there, saying they're programmatically they're failures. They may not be. They may be requirement failures, design failures. There may be all sorts of different things.
Customer no happy.
Yeah, and the thing is that we as humans like to label things. And we often just adopt the simplest or easiest or patterns. We don't often mean to have a sort of second meaning to things, like a test failure. But we can't help as human beings to put other meanings onto words. But that's going into the semantics of language quite detailed there. But we've got to be very careful because, as I said, one sentence doesn't have a big impact. But say that sentence 1,000 times, it starts to matter. Say that as a leader, it matters more. Did President Trump talk about bleach or disinfectant or something like that? He's only said it once, but it's gone around the world.
It's influence, though, isn't it? It really is. Yeah. It's like there's a specific, with great power comes great responsibility, and you've got influence and this and the other. Like when somebody says something and they are in a position of influence, people genuinely listen to them, and that's why someone like Michael Bolton goes on about the checking testing thing. It becomes a really mainline debate within the testing world. The rest of the world, it means nothing to them. But for testing, like if you're in those sorts of things, it's a sore point for a lot of people. I mean, Alan Page throws it away like nobody's business. It's a real thing, because what do we mean by those things when I talk about it? Like when I say, hey guys, that can offend people, pronouns and things, and they can do. And being conscious of those sorts of things, even if nothing that I'm saying means anything that I'm projecting onto you, you don't know how it's going to be interpreted by other people.
The challenge with life is you've got to be careful what you say, but you also got to be careful how you interpret what other people say. It's a two-way street.
Yep.
You can't know how someone will interpret your words, so you've got to kind of be careful. But at the same time, when you listen to somebody, you've also got to be careful how you absorb that information. So if someone says you're wrong, it doesn't mean you're diabolically wrong. It could just mean I don't agree with you. And you've got to be careful that you understand the language that's being used as well.
That's one of the biggest learnings I've had since becoming more senior and having responsibility for a team is you have to be self-aware of how the stuff you're saying comes across and how people could potentially interpret it, because you can never predict how everyone's going to interpret what you say. And you may find that 90% of your team are happy with it, but there's that one person that you've said something that just didn't quite hit them in the same way. And that can knock you back. It can knock you if you didn't realize it, and then you realize that someone's actually either hurt or offended or something from that. Yeah, self-awareness of how things can be interpreted is huge.
It's a bit like what we were talking about last time on the one-to-one, is how you approach the people in your group. Is what works for one person may not work for others. And as long as we are aware of how we react to those people and learn from it, so we don't go do the same mistake again, then that's an improvement. But it's preventing making those same mistakes each and every time, and also making us aware of that each person is an individual. And I think that's another thing about the sort of leadership thing, is that the sort of bias is that one message can be the same for everyone. Having that leadership, you recognize that each person is an individual and will react in a different way. And so actually sometimes it's better to give a message on a one-to-one basis with certain people, or in a smaller group or a large group with others. And it's making sure that that message is correct for the message that you're trying to give. Because in a large group, you can have a confrontation if someone takes it wrongly, and it can damage the relationship within the larger group. Whereas if it was just a one-to-one, then that damage can be limited.
And that's why those kind of questions are some of the things that when I take on a new team, I have questions that I'll ask everyone. And one of them is, how do you like receiving feedback? Because there will be those ones that don't like big group feedback sessions and prefer to have the personal touch. There'll be others that are just, I don't care. Just tell me what you need to tell me whenever you need to tell me it in whatever scenario. So yeah, you're right. It's very important on context.
It's interesting how that changes the dynamic depending on the team size, team structures,
Yes,
and the size of them, and the levels. So obviously, cascading to a team of 4 or a team of 10 that you just directly report to is different to team. Like say you manage 5 team leaders who then report into another 10 people, and how you get those informations across, and how you choose to cascade / talk to everyone, how you make things available. Do you get all your team leaders on board before you get your kind of everyone else on board? Do you treat everyone as equal? It raises lots of questions, and obviously it gets harder and harder, I guess, probably the higher up you get, the more in that pyramid almost that you work with. Trying to announce something to, say, 100 people is very different to a team of 10, and the dynamics change. I would love to sometimes just talk one-on-one with people, but there's a point of scale which sometimes you can't. I know that some of the CEOs have had in the past, they've got 13,000 people. That sort of messages goes out the window, and you've got to find ways. And the more tiers you end up having, often the different message comes across. So if I told a team leader something, and then they told their team, the message, the more levels you have, the more convoluted the message gets usually, or diluted.
I was going to say that also, going back to the biases, is that, with the hierarchy, people, as a leader, you need to be aware that you don't always tell the same person first every time, because otherwise naturally they will think, oh, well, they're the favorite, okay, and I'm the last person to know, which isn't necessarily the case. But we need to be very aware that those biases aren't there, so that therefore they're told randomly. Naturally, there often is a pattern, but we need to try our best to break that.
Yeah, I think I was just going to go back to the point Russell's making about the number of people, and I think it's actually made me realise something just now in that moment of how difficult it must be for someone that's in a very senior position that has to announce a message to hundreds of people. We've had situations recently where it's been a pre-recorded message that's been played over for a meeting rather than being a live meeting, and everyone's grumbled about why is it pre-recorded, etc., etc. But actually, to announce some of the messages that need to be announced sometimes that may not be very positive, doing it interactively will just throw you off, and actually having to be able to sit down and read from a script for 20 minutes to get the message out as it needs to be portrayed is actually probably the best way to do it. But as a person that is trying to put themselves in that situation, saying, well, I'll do it differently. Well, actually, it's very different in the context. If you've got hundreds and hundreds of people that need to get that message, it's very easy to sometimes get that bias wrong again, thinking that it'd be easy to do it this way.
Yeah, we all use our own experiences, and often, certainly my experiences, I haven't gone to 1,000 people and ever talked to them. It's easy to think, well, that's what I would do. I'd get people into groups, cascade it down team leaders. I've cascaded things through team leaders before. As I said, different information needs to come out to the bottom is my best way of describing it.
Yeah, I would agree.
It has, depending on what you're trying to do, but if the detail is important, so let's say financial information for the current coronavirus, etc., what's going to happen to your position, the company, that sort of stuff. You want it to be consistent. Everyone to get the message at the same sort of time, which is different to if you're telling someone about a new tool that you're going to trial or something like that, or a new direction that you're going to get a team to experiment with. You've got to be very careful. But yeah, you're right. Going back to biases again, we've got to make sure that if we're leading people, but we help them challenge their bias. We,
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
give inflection on what's going on to kind of give alternative narratives and things. Because yeah, it is very easy to say I would do something different, but yeah, you might, but you don't actually go have the context of it and to know what choice you would really make.
I've been thinking about the letter C with regards
Yeah.
to these things. So you got cognitive, right? But we talked about wanting to be challenged. You want to be credible. Your cognitive biases you don't want to find yourself complacent. Otherwise, you become a bit of a coward. But basically, I wanted credibility to be a thing. Because if you're a leader, you want to come across as credible, which is where one of those things is.
Yeah.
You want to earn that respect. You want to own that respect. You want to be credible with the information that you profess. If you want people to actually believe in what you're saying, but you also need to be in that position where you can be challenged and you can be personable. And the ways that you do things, people don't always think, I wouldn't do it like that. You don't have to always explain yourself. You shouldn't have to always explain yourself. But you should be prepared to be able to explain yourself. You should be in a position to be open for people to contact you and to create those conversations if you need them. So just knowing your own biases, knowing your own weaknesses, knowing how you reach the point that you got to is just as important as actually just saying something and having all this stuff in the background that isn't actually pushed out. So even though my little C thing was stupid, I think we might have been okay.
So finishing off this
Yeah.
cognitive bias sort of discussion.
Yes, going back to that. Yes.
No, I'm doing a Chris really. Is there anything really odd that really annoys you, and what is your bias behind it? So I'll start first. So my thing that I really gets my go is people slurping their drinks just constant when they take it. Don't do stuff. It's slurping their drinks, because I have the impression that people that slurp their drinks are sloppy and don't take a lot of care because they can't control their mouths, because they're just slurping their drinks. So is there anything that you have that is irrational, and what's the bias behind it?
Yeah, I've got one. It's one my wife gets frustrated with me, and I think other people do as well. Is I have this frustration that other people can't use technology the same way I can in certain situations. Like trying to get a Zoom call set up with people that don't know how to use Zoom. It frustrates me that it's not common knowledge that everyone else knows how to use the tool as well. And it's that thing of having to. I can sometimes be quite condescending when trying to give instructions on how to do something. To the point my gran now asks me to write it all down for her, because she doesn't like me having to tell her. But it's a frustration for me that I don't give credit to the fact that I've learned that through the path of career I've decided to take, and actually it's not natural for everybody. But it's a bias that it gets me every time someone asks me how do I use this. It's just like this. Just do that. I paid someone else off because I've spoke to them in a way I shouldn't have done.
So what about you two?
So overconfidence is kind of a thing that I want people to be sure and go ahead and do things, but I kind of get very frustrated by people that are confident. I want them to actually reflect and show things, because my general mentality is always reflect, to give options, to give multiple things. So someone that goes incredibly confident into something and I don't see that they've considered alternatives or anything else, I have a dislike, and I kind of go away from it. So the confidence thing to me, I show when I'm confident, I try and say why. Like, yeah, this is it because of X, Y, and Z. If someone just goes, yeah, that's it, I can't stand it. It's kind of like, it naturally makes me go, why, like a child. And I need to have reasons, not just an answer. And I can't understand how anyone can work without explaining themselves. I have a hatred of anyone who goes down that path, I guess. Unnatural, and I'm aware of its unnatural hatred. Or bias, sorry, not hatred.
Chris?
I guess there's two things specifically in life generally that wind me up. One is the way people will read a message but not respond to it when you've seen that they've read it. And this it's not so much when you're with like friends and stuff. I can understand people have got life and work, but when you're working with people and you've got like an IM tool, and you can see they're there, and you've sent them a quick message, give me a shout, you're free, and then they've read it, and they go and talk to the person next to you, and you're like, or if you've sent an email, everyone needs to check their emails, and people go, I didn't read that email, because they filter out an email or something. People who don't want to consume information, don't want to connect with people as much as I do, Mr. Context Shift over here, like, it winds me up like nobody's business that people haven't engaged with those things. And I totally get it that people are in flow. Flow isn't a thing that I particularly have to deal with, but that does wind me up. The other thing that really winds me up, the other thing that really winds me up is people who treat the knowledge of how something works, or they've discovered something and they keep it to themselves. And while I know sometimes it's a teaching opportunity to let people find their own path and things, sometimes it's just useful to share how something works so somebody doesn't get stuck. Sometimes you're like, I can speed up your life by telling you, don't do that because this will happen. Or any of those sorts of things, or people that use it as like a self-preservation, like, I'm a single point failure, I have to be here, my job's safe because I'm the only person that knows this thing. I've always seen it as an opposite thing, where somebody who can find something out quickly and teach other people is so much more valuable to me, and the kind of people I'm way more interested in, the people who know how to do stuff and don't tell me.
So I've got a weird thing to add. Obviously, we talked about biases to start with, yeah? I'm just wondering how much Simon's choice of his answer has biased both our answers. Simon obviously talked about sort of technology, being confident and kind of not really explaining it very well, not getting how other people didn't get it. I talked about people who were overconfident and didn't explain the why, which is kind of almost the same thing, but in a broader context. And you've just brought up a very similar sort of point. Now, either we've all got similar points, or we've all just had bias drawn upon us.
I actually managed to anchor you to your answers.
Yes, I'm just wondering how much of that is true, and how we got biased by a very simple question and answer, and how much our podcast therefore might always be biased because one of our answers will trigger the other answer.
It's probably very likely, because when you're talking to people and there's a common thread just dropped in there, your brain, even at the back of your head, even if you're not engaging with it, it's thinking about things. It's joining together little dots, and it's going, oh, I can tell a little story about this sort of thing. It's really exciting.
Exactly. This is how our brains work. This is not brain malfunctioning, if that makes sense. But it's being aware of it and challenging ourselves and thinking, actually, how much of what we do is based on the context, the bias of where we are, what we talked about, and how much is actually the true meaning. If someone came back to us tomorrow and all asked us by email, what's the same question, I guarantee we'd come up with different answers because the context has changed.
Unless we're being stubborn, saying the same ones because you just told them.
Yeah, or we don't want to think about it again because we thought about it once. But it's just interesting how bias creeps in. That was kind of what I was trying to highlight.
Do you think it works also with like earworms and stuff, like as in like music terms? So like if you hear just a tiny bit of someone humming a certain song, suddenly that song is stuck in your head. Do you think that's the same sort of thing? Because it could be like if somebody went shabba-dabba-dabba-dabba, would that get stuck in your head?
I guess maybe. There's obviously, we're testers, or we're not sort of brain and psychologists and other people, so probably can't go into that depth unless we want to do a PhD or master's in the area. But I imagine there's some chemical and some neurological processes that explain a bit about why we have these sort of neural pathways that connect and we follow. But
sounds interesting, actually, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. But this is beyond the field of testing now into just general thought processing, I think.
One thing I was going to say was that actually the whole point of this sort of podcast is the fact that, and conversations, is that you do react to what other people are actually saying. However, I think it's more important and more valuable if there are more than one person, even though if we are a bit biased by what other people say, because actually it's a collective discussion rather than just one person putting their bias out to everybody.
Yeah, biases aren't, as I said, a negative thing necessarily. Just interesting to see how they impact what we do. And impact again.
It's about how you manage them.
Yeah. I was just curious of myself, reflecting back on my own answer, thinking, hang on a minute, that sounds actually not that dissimilar, and so on, and how my own thinking process was obviously triggered off by what Simon had said. But yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's interesting how our brains interconnect, and yeah, it's how conversations work, I guess.
If you have any cognitive bias stories, maybe you've had some odd cognitive biases yourself that have been confirmed in some way, please feel free to contact us, either at contact us at testingpeers.com or at testingpeers on Twitter. Thank you for listening to this episode. Feel free to review us, subscribe, rate us on whichever of your podcast streaming tools you use. And we look forward to speaking to you next time. For now, it's goodbye from the Testing Peers.
Goodbye.